The third area was lawsuits amongst believers. And again, this desire of Christians to take each other to court when clearly things would be better settled amongst our own and not to resort to the law courts. Paul's principal concern with that was obviously that if Christians are seen griping in public, then any talk of unity and brotherly love was presumably seen as a fabrication, and so therefore, if we were taking each other to court, then we were not being proper Christians. I think there's a lot of truth in that. The idea is that what we ought to do is reconcile ourselves and not look necessarily for a third party in order to be able to facilitate our discussions, because again, our relationship with God would suggest that we do need to be very mindful, very thoughtful, and very kind to each other. Not everyone's going to agree all of the time. Some people are going to act selfishly or not in the best interests of all, and so therefore we need to take them to one side and gently talk to them and perhaps admonish them. But if we're relying on the courts in order to manage our affairs, then we probably overlook something of gargantuan significance. The next area is directions concerning marriage. Now, there's no doubt about it. Paul was very socially conservative, as I think probably people were in his day. But it's also important to recognise that Paul wasn't talking about marriage as we would understand it, with that legally binding parties idea that was developed by the church in the early part of the second millennium. The idea that was prevalent at the time of Paul was very much of a covenant of mutuality and of trust, where two people would agree to be married and where life expectancies were much shorter. And so therefore it was not necessarily a long-term exercise, but it was principally for the what we call begetting, the conception and birth of children, and the raising of those children to an age where they can continue the family. And it was very important that those marriages, those relationships, were identified as being in some way sacred, holy, and indefilable. What we mean by that is that they were not open to third parties or others, that actually it was a private affair between two people, and so therefore these were emblematic of our relationship with God, and Jesus and his bride, the church, which is a covenanted mutual relationship, and so that was very, very important to Paul. And that these relationships did not brook the interference by a third party or anybody else. But there was also a presupposition, an assumption that you would be loyal to your spouse and only to your spouse, to the exclusion of all others. And that idea hasn't shifted. That certainly remained the bedrock of the church's understanding of marriage right the way through its history. But it's only really in the last few hundred years that the process of marriage has become formalised into a civil / religious context. Up until that point, God had just blessed all relationships because they were like his relationship, or God's relationship, I should say, to creation. And that was the key element to it. So that's very important. And Paul is very keen to emphasize that in his teaching about marriage. And that those who, for whatever reason, were unmarried, or those who were formerly married but perhaps widowed or widows, needed to be supported in society. And again, this was a very short-term view, that we would only be looking after people for a few years until the parousia, until the second coming, until we were all taken to heaven. And so therefore it was a moral obligation on the part of a very great number of people in order to look after everybody. So it's quite a different view than we have 2,000 years later, but there are some really important elements that we need to underline and that are important. And it is that covenanted nature of relationships that is most important. Another little area, probably it only gets one chapter, is food offered to idols. And this is this broader thing about food laws and concerns about lots and lots of religious people coming together, converting to Christianity, and having lots of views about whether or not food should be offered to idols, to gods, other gods, and so on. And perhaps people were having a little bit of a two-way bet on leaving some food out. And therefore, was it possible for people, for example, to eat food that had been given to idols? And I think Paul's view pretty much was, well, look, there is only one God. Our sacrifice is the Eucharist. If you want to do anything else, that's probably not a good thing. But at the same time, people are growing in their faith, and people are getting out of one sense, one understanding, one faith, and moving into another. And it's that transitional period where people may struggle to let go of one thing and move into another. And I think that's absolutely true of most people who come to faith, and it's really important for us to be sensitive to that. Those of us who have been around for a long, long time obviously have a very deep faith, and presumably fairly frequent doubts, as one ought. And it's inappropriate for us to mock others who have not been in a relationship with God for quite as long, and whose, in many ways, whose faith is perhaps more sure and more simple, perhaps, if I could put it like that. Anyway, Paul then goes on, the fourth area in his letter: authority. Now, it has to be said that authority is at the heart of pretty much every argument in the church. Who is in charge? It was the first argument in the church at the Council of Jerusalem. Who's in charge? Who gets to make the policy? Is it Peter, who was there at the beginning, or was it Paul, who has had this amazing Damascene experience on the road? Is it the collective of the great and the good, the actual eyewitnesses to the life of Christ? Is it those who can pray hardest? Who is in charge? And of course, we're still having those exact same discussions. Who gets to determine what doctrine is? Who gets to say what Scripture means? Who gets to say who's in charge and who does what? And every decision that is made in the church, in my humble opinion, it somehow or other impacts on that. And so, therefore, it's often important to be able to frame an argument against somebody else on grounds that they can't deal with, that they can't fight on, and that way we exploit people. And that may be an unpopular view, but I think it's very, very prevalent. The next part of this is our behaviour at the Lord's Supper, and we should take to heart the fact that clearly a number of people weren't participating in the Eucharist in a seemly manner, as we would want them to do, and were in fact arriving drunk, or were eating the Lord's Supper before others, or were racing to the front and leaving their slaves and other poorer people, shall we say, behind. And I wouldn't want to make any parallels with modern Christianity, but could it be? Could it be?